Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here. A happy new year to you all, a happy and healthy 2017 in front of you, I hope. And today I would like to work through with you the derivation of the long run classical aggregate supply curve. So I've just started the A2 macro course with my year 13 economists, and we've had 2 lessons on this now. And in this next video, which will be slightly longer than others, and I do apologise for that, but I feel it's necessary in order to explain how we derive this long-run aggregate supply curve. So I am basically working from page 226 in the Peter Smith OCR A2 textbook. And in order to deal with the concepts on the first few pages of this particular chapter 13 in the textbook, I'm going to be revisiting 1 or 2 concepts first of all. So I'm going to be revisiting the concept of the transmission mechanism. Those of you who were involved in the Bank of England challenge will be very familiar with this. I'm then going to take a little look at the quantity theory of money, which many of you may have encountered when you've looked at the whole notion of inflation and causes of inflation. I'm going to take a very brief look at some very simple micro-analysis with regard to supply and costs of production. I'm going to take a little bit of a look at the real wage, this thing that we refer to as the real wage. And then once we've done that, I'm going to get into the diagram which is on page 227 of your textbook, and hopefully give you a little bit more background, a little bit more flesh on the skeleton of the bones with regard to what's in your textbook about how we derive this long-run aggregate supply curve. I personally love this stuff. I think it's really interesting, it's really fascinating, and I hope that you love it too. So let's get to it, ladies and gentlemen. The transmission mechanism. What is the transmission mechanism? The transmission mechanism explains to us how changes in the money market feed through into the real economy, as stated here. Now, what do we mean by the real economy? We're primarily looking at 3 key things: real output, employment, and inflation. And we can draw 3 diagrams like this in order to illustrate this notion of the transmission mechanism. Now this is it's a fairly simplistic way of doing this, but I think it's quite effective. So we've got the money market, we've got investment demand, and we've got the real economy. So I'll work through this with you just step by step. In the money market, we have the money supply curve. Now you can see that this is a perfectly inelastic supply curve. Why? Because the money supply is fixed. And who's it fixed by? It's fixed by the central bank. So it's fixed at a certain point, and that is our money supply. The money demand curve slopes downwards from left to right. Now you'll be aware, I'm sure, that there are 2 or 3 reasons why that's the case. So I'm not going to get into them all in this particular video. But one reason, of course, is when the interest rate is high, the opportunity cost of keeping your money in your pocket rather than in the bank is much higher. And so you're less likely to hold money in your back pocket than you are in the bank. Vice versa, when the interest rate is low, you're much more inclined to have a high demand for money, as in money for spending, cash balances, rather than keep the money in the bank, because the opportunity cost of holding that money is low because you get much lower interest rate on that money anyway. And so that's why the money demand curve slopes downwards from left to right. So, at the intersection of the money supply curve and the money demand curve, we can then derive an interest rate. So that's where our interest rate is determined, in these money markets. Now that then will lead to a certain level of investment in the economy. And again, we are talking here about investment by firms on capital equipment. Now think about that for a moment. Capital equipment, we mean machinery, things which are expensive, things for which many firms will have to borrow funds in order to make that particular capital purchase. Now, if the interest rate is high, then the borrowing costs and the financing costs of making that purchase are also very high. And so one would anticipate that when the interest rate is high, investment demand will be lower. High interest rate, low investment demand. When the interest rate is low, there'll be much higher levels of investment demand going on in the economy. And that makes sense. And so what we can do here is we will take the interest rate across, so we just dash this across like so. We've got the level of interest rate there, R1, and that gives rise to a certain level of investment, I1. So interest rate determined in the money market yields a certain level of investment, I1, as shown here. And then finally, you'll be familiar with the aggregate demand equation. AD is equal to C excuse me, plus I plus G plus X minus M. You'll have written this so many times now, I'm sure. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, of course, the component that we are really interested in here in this particular analysis is the investment component. We're assuming that everything else, C, G, X and M, they all remain equal, ceteris paribus, in other words. And so what we're going to say here is that this level of investment, I1, yields a certain level of aggregate demand, AD1, where AD1 is equal to C plus I1 plus G plus X minus M. Okay, so that's our basic starting point for the transmission mechanism. Now, the word transmission, obviously, it's like transmit, isn't it? So we are now going to transmit a change in the money market, which will then transmit changes through to the real economy. So let's do that. So the particular change that we're going to go for here is that we're going to say there is an increase in the money supply. So the money supply curve shifts to the right, to MS2. As a consequence, I'm sure you've spotted this already, the new equilibrium in the money market is here, which yields a lower rate of interest, R2. That rate of interest, R2, delivers a much higher level of investment of I2. Now think about that for a moment. AD we know is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C to the I to the G to the X minus M. Well, if the I component has gone up, then the AD goes up. What happens on the right hand side goes up, so the left hand side must go up as well. And so as a consequence, the AD value is greater. So we could reasonably and rationally say that AD will have shifted to the right. And so we can do that on our final diagram. Let's just draw that. There we have it, ladies and gentlemen. So there is our new AD curve, AD2, which is equal to C plus I2, which is the higher level of investment, plus G plus X minus M. So a change in the money market, which brought about a reduction in the interest rate, has transmitted an impact into the real economy. Now what is likely, let's think about what's likely to have happened in the real economy to these three components. Output, employment and inflation. Well, we're moving in this direction, so we can say that real output will have increased. We can also say that employment is likely to have gone up because AD is rising and so the economy is getting bigger. And we can see that this, although it's moving to the right, it's also moving upwards, so that there's probably some inflationary pressure building here. But we'll come back to that shortly. But we can say, we can make that assumption that we've got some sort of inflationary pressure building in the economy. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the transmission mechanism in a very simple form. Now, those of you who subscribe to the Economic Review, as I do, you may have seen this particular poster on the transmission mechanism. and I gave this to my students this morning. This is an excellent outline of the transmission mechanism because it goes into what we've described here, but goes into various other aspects of transmission within the transmission mechanism. So I'll try and put a little link in this video to this document. I'll try and find out how to do that. I think you can do that, and hopefully you can get a look at it, or maybe I'll take a photo and just put it at the end or something. So that's that. Okie dokie, let's move on. The quantity theory of money, ladies and gentlemen. This is a theory which you may have encountered when you were looking at the cause of inflation. So demand pull inflation, cost pull inflation, and monetary inflation. So this one is specifically to do with inflation caused by excessive growth of the money supply. I hope that you're familiar with this quote, and if not, I would suggest that you do learn it. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's a very famous quote by Milton Friedman, basically saying, and the general gist of it being, that if you increase the money supply, the only thing that you'll stoke in the economy is inflation rather than economic growth. So this particular theory suggests that any attempt to increase the level of economic activity simply by using the money supply, and if we just go back to our transmission mechanism here, so by doing something like this, what Friedman is saying and what this theory suggests is that the only thing you'll generate is inflation. Well, let's just consider this. So the QTM, quantity theory of money, is equal to MV. The equation for it is MV is equal to PT, where M is the money supply, V is what's known as the velocity of circulation. Now that really simply means how quickly money is changing hands. Obviously the faster it's changing hands, the more activity you have, therefore the more likely it is that the economy will be growing. P being the price per transaction, and T being the number of transactions. Now this theory makes an assumption about two of the variables which makes the theory on the one hand rather simplistic, but also makes it easy for us to interpret. So the assumptions are, as I've highlighted for you, that the velocity of circulation and the number of transactions are both constant. Now, think about that for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, in the pure and simple mathematics of this. If both sides of these equations are supposed to be equal, and these two things are constant, then that obviously means that if you double something, for example, on the left-hand side of the equation, then the variable on the right-hand side, which is not constant, that would also have to double. And so this theory, in very simple terms, says if you, for example, double the money supply, the only thing that will lead to is a doubling in the price level, a doubling of inflation. And that really, in a nutshell, that is the quantity theory of money. Now it begs the question, and you're probably asking yourselves this at the moment as well, if that's the case, why do governments all around the globe nowadays keep pumping money into the economies in order to try and stimulate growth via quantitative easing? And we could go into that and we can consider that, and indeed universities are now asking themselves this very question because they're saying to themselves, surely this is totally broken down, this theory. Think of the amount of quantitative easing in our economy and think of the very low rates of inflation that we have, 1.2%. Yet we've got £435 billion worth of quantitative easing in the economy. How does that tally with this quantity theory? It doesn't. And one of the things about universities and delivering economics courses and so on is that they're now reassessing as to whether or not it's viable to teach these things. But anyway, that's by the by. So that's quantity theory. Moving on to the basic micro. You'll remember supply curve slopes upwards from left to right. If there's an increase in the costs of production for a firm, the supply curve would shift to the left. That's all I want to say on that, but it's essential for what we're going to come on to do. And then finally, excuse me, ladies and gents, what about individuals wishing to maintain their purchasing power? So, for example, there's something called the real wage. And it is measured by this equation, W over P, where W is the money wage and P is the price level. So, for example, if you were to get a 10% increases in prices in the economy, well, people who are switched on, they would think to themselves, okay, my money wage hasn't changed this week, but prices are 10% higher. So if I'm to buy the same basket of goods as I did last week, I really need a 10% increase in wages. And so they may approach their employer and they may say that very thing to them. They may say, prices have gone up by 10%. In order to maintain my purchasing power, I need my money wage to be lifted by 10%. And that would restore, it wouldn't make them better off, but it would mean that they could buy the same basket of goods as they could previously. So it is restoring their purchasing power. Now in the same way, for example, and when we look at the classical supply curve, you'll see that this is the case. If prices fell by 10%, it wouldn't be, I mean, you wouldn't expect this to happen obviously, but in order to restore purchasing power, workers might go to their employer and say, prices have fallen, I'm now relatively better off, therefore I'm willing to take a 10% pay cut in order that I can still simply afford the same basket of goods today as I could previously. Obviously, it's pretty unlikely to happen. But that is to do with our purchasing power. So I'm just going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen, because it's coming to a break here for us. So I'll stop and then I'll pick this up again once this room has cleared, and we'll move on and we'll get really stuck in then to the classical aggregate supply curve derivation. Hi guys, it's Geekonomics rejoining you once again, and you rejoin me as we now delve into the most exciting part of this, where we now begin to derive the classical aggregate supply curve. So in your textbook on page 227, I believe, you will find this diagram. So what do we have? We have two AD curves, C to the I to the G to the X minus M. And we have two short run aggregate supply curves, short run. Now you can see that they become progressively more steep. They're getting steeper as we move from left to right. Now obviously in the short run, as you begin to use up your resources and you're beginning to reach the maximum capacity of your resources that you have available in the short run, then the amount of incremental increase in output and real output that you can get with those resources starts to tail off, and hence the short run aggregate supply curve becomes steeper. So we're starting, ladies and gentlemen, at initial equilibrium, P1, Y1, an equilibrium point of A. And your textbook says, well, what if there's an increase in AD? Well, what if there is an increase in AD? Ordinarily, we would move from A to B. So new equilibrium with a higher price level and a higher level of real output. However, and this is why I've gone through all that rigmarole previously, if we think back to what we talked about here with regard to costs and purchasing power and real wages, when we move to point B, we can see that there has been a price increase. Now, as a consequence of that price increase, the real wage and the purchasing power of individuals will have fallen. And so what would rational workers do if they had the ability to do it? They would approach their employer and they would say, please sir, I want some more. We need to restore our purchasing power. Now, if that was agreed by the employer, then the employer's costs of production would increase, which would shift the short-run aggregate supply curve, effectively the cost curve here, if you think of it like that, from SAS1 to SAS2. And so we would arrive at this new equilibrium position, shown by point C here. But now the price level has increased to P3. So what's happened here, ladies and gentlemen? Let's analyse this. What has happened? In an attempt to increase the level of real output, and let's say that that attempt has been via an increase in the money supply in order to stimulate AD through the transmission mechanism. So we've got AD shifting to the right. For a short time period, we've moved beyond Y1. We've moved to Y2. But in the longer term, as purchasing power has been restored and as a consequence costs have increased, the short-run aggregate supply curve moves upwards and to the left, and so we arrive at this new equilibrium once again, which is at point C, P3 at Y1. Now what if this process were to be repeated, ladies and gentlemen? So let's say that the government of the day said, okay, let's give this another bash. Let's try and increase AD once again. So AD shifts again to AD3. We end up at point D. Sorry, got that in the wrong place, haven't we? Got that on SAS1. We end up here on point D, where we have once again a new higher price level. I'm going to take this across because it does tend to make the diagrams rather complicated looking. So we've got a new higher price level, and this is Y1, and we're moved to point D, so we've moved beyond Y1. So once again, for a time, we've got an increase in the level of real output. However, once again, workers will realise that their purchasing power has fallen. They approach their employer, they ask for a wage increase. Costs of production rise, and so SAS2 will shift, and we end up here at SAS3. So we're at point E. As you can see, all the while what's happening, we're going A to B but back to C, C to D but back to E. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's a pattern here, and I hope that you've spotted it. I was begging my students this morning to spot the pattern. What is the pattern, ladies and gentlemen? And this is something that you will have come across, I'm sure, in your Year 12 studies. In your youth, you may have used and amused yourselves with dot-to-dot books. Now there are a few dots here that if we join them together, it will just open a whole new world to us, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to do that now for you. We have point A, we have point C, we have point E. These are the points which we keep coming back to all the while. Now if we join these together, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope this is like a light bulb moment for you, if we join these together and we get this, I know that's not, if I was doing this with the shape recognition, this would be a perfectly inelastic curve. But this is the long run aggregate supply curve, ladies and gentlemen, or indeed otherwise known as the classical aggregate supply curve. Now, what do classics believe about demand management policies? Classics would argue that any attempt by the government of the day to increase output beyond this level here, Y1, which we call something very special, which we'll mention in a moment, but any attempt to boost the level of real output above that simply leads to inflation. And so the long-run aggregate supply curve is perfectly inelastic. Indeed, any attempt to use demand management to go beyond Y1 simply leads to inflation. This is the reason why, ladies and gentlemen, that the classical aggregate supply, the classical economists would argue that the best policy to use is supply side policy rather than demand management policies. And I'm sure last year you'll have been familiar with drawing the classical aggregate supply curve as a vertical, perfectly inelastic curve. Maybe you called it the long run aggregate supply curve rather than the classical aggregate supply curve. But classics argue that this point here, y1, this is a very special point because we keep coming back to it, A to B to C, C to D to E, we keep coming back to it. And they refer to this point as the natural rate of unemployment, otherwise known as YN, the natural rate of unemployment. You'll be familiar with the fact that Keynesians refer to a full employment level of real output. Classics talk about this natural rate. And if you want to affect the natural rate, you've got to use supply side policy rather than demand management policies. Now, what else can we show here? 3 other very important points. A, C, E. At each of these points, ladies and gentlemen, the inflation rate is stable and static. If we're to the left or to the right of either of these points, we'd be either moving up the short-run aggregate supply curve, in which case inflation would be rising, or we'd be moving down it, in which case inflation would be falling. So these points A, C and E are the points at which inflation is, the correct terminology, non-accelerating. And these points, ladies and gentlemen, I love this, ladies and gentlemen, these are known as the points of the NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Isn't that brilliant? Tremendous that, isn't it? A, C and E, the non-accelerating inflation rates of unemployment. Okay, now what if, so we know that the classical aggregate supply curve is vertical, what if it was decided that actually E is too high? E is too high a level of inflation. Let's do something about it. What would that be? That would involve the transmission mechanism again, but obviously operating in reverse. So if we go back to our transmission mechanism diagram, we'd maybe want to reduce the money supply, increase the interest rate, and ultimately lower the rate of AD. That's the thinking behind it. Now, how would that work, ladies and gentlemen? Let's say we're at point A and we decided to do that, or the government of the day decided to do that. So first thing would happen would AD3 would shift down to AD2. So from point E we would move to point F. Workers, in theory, and bear in mind it is only in theory, they would realise now that prices had fallen from this high level at E, they're now fallen to a level of P4. And they would realise, oh, actually, I can buy a more substantial basket of goods, more substantial, with the same money wage. So they'd approach their employer and say, I'll take a wage cut. Prices have fallen by 10%, I'll take a wage cut of 10%. I'm no worse off, I can still afford to buy the same basket of goods. And so as a consequence, the firm's costs would fall this time, and so the short-run aggregate supply curve 3 would move to 2. And so you'd end up moving from E to F to C. And the process could be repeated again, so you could go from C to G back to A. So this can be a sort of a cyclical process, ladies and gentlemen. Now, of course, I'm sure you're thinking to yourselves, well, who in their right mind was going to take a cut in their money wage? And I absolutely agree with you in that respect. And indeed, when we get to the derivation of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, that notion of wages being sticky in a downwards direction, that really comes into play very significantly. But classics assume that wages and prices are, number one, flexible, number two, instantaneously flexible, and number three, flexible in either an upwards direction or a downwards direction. And hence, as a consequence of that, we always end up back at this natural rate of unemployment and hence as a consequence of that, the long run aggregate supply curve is perfectly inelastic. So this is great stuff, ladies and gentlemen. This is A2 macro. I love this stuff. I hope you do too, and I look forward to bringing you the next video, which will be on the derivation of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. So keep subscribing. Let's make it a tremendous new year for economics, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.